Novel Revision, Prep 2. Question 1. Mr. Edison's suspicions changed towards Hyde. They developed from one thing to another. At the beginning, he knew little about Mr. Hyde. For him, it was just a name. Later, when he heard Mr. Infield's story about Mr. Hyde when he stepped on the girl, he started to believe that it was a case of blackmailing. He believed that there was something shameful about Jekyll's will. He also thought that if Hyde knew anything about the will, he would kill Dr. Jekyll. Question 2. Compare between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde physically and symbolically. Dr. Jekyll was a large, well-built, smooth-faced man of 50. He looked clever, kind, and able. He symbolized goodness. On the contrary, Hyde, who symbolizes evil, was like a pitiless machine. He looked ugly and scornful. He spoke like the devil himself, and there was something unnatural about his appearance. Mr. Edison represented the typical Victorian character. Explain. He was a lawyer with severe expression. He rarely smiled. He was tall and dull, but still quite lovable. He felt awkward in conversation, and his remarks were short and cold. He rarely showed his feelings. He was strict with himself. He drank spirits when he was alone to destroy his taste for wine. And although he enjoyed theater, he hadn't seen a play for 20 years. He also avoided gossiping when he was walking with Mr. Infield on Sunday mornings. That's why he is a true Victorian. Stevenson's way to criticize the Victorian era is obvious through his novel. Although the Victorian era was the age of morals and morality, Stevenson presented the character of Hyde, which represented pure evil. Question 5. What story did Mr. Infield tell Mr. Edison about Mr. Hyde? Mr. Infield told Mr. Edison that one day when he was coming late at night, he saw Mr. Hyde stepping on a little girl and left her crying in the street. Question 6. How did Mr. Infield describe Mr. Hyde and what was his effect on people? Mr. Infield described Mr. Hyde saying that he wasn't like a man. He was some pitiless machine. His looks were ugly and scornful that made Mr. Infield himself tremble. He was a man who nobody wouldn't want to deal with. He was such an unpleasant man. He speaks like the devil himself. Mr. Infield and the child's family had been filled with violent hatred of him at first sight. Even the doctor, to whom the girl had been sent to, turned sick and white with the desire to kill him. However, it was difficult for Mr. Infield to describe Mr. Hyde physically. He was the nastiest person he had ever seen. He was deformed. He was a very unusual-looking man. Question 8. When Mr. Edison paid a visit to Dr. Lanyon to ask him about Dr. Jekyll and his relation to Hyde, he was disappointed. Justify your answer. When he visited Dr. Lanyon, he was shocked to know that Dr. Lanyon hadn't seen Dr. Jekyll for more than 10 years, since he began to go wrong in his ideas. His ideas were unscientific nonsense for Dr. Lanyon. Question 9. I shall say nothing until I have seen the body. Mr. Edison said that to the police officer at Mr. Edison's house when the police reached him because of an envelope that was found with Sir Vescaru. Mr. Edison recognized the body as he was Caru's professional advisor, and he refused to say anything until he saw his body. Question 10. He's in trouble. What has he done? Hyde's maid said those words to the policeman when he came with Mr. Edison to Hyde's house in Soho after the murder of Sir Vescaru. She was happy when she knew he was in trouble. A flash of cruel joy appeared on her face when she knew that he was wanted by the police. He didn't seem to be a popular character. I only ask for justice. Dr. Jekyll said that to Mr. Edison at Dr. Jekyll's house when he went to visit him and ask him about Mr. Hyde. Mr. Edison advised Dr. Jekyll concerning his will, but it was all in vain. Dr. Jekyll said that when Mr. Edison told him that he can't promise to like Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll said that he wasn't asking him to like Mr. Hyde, but he's asking him to give him his rights if he was gone. He asked him to promise to do so. That shows how much Dr. Jekyll was interested in Mr. Hyde. Question 12. I know you have seen him. Comment. Dr. Jekyll said that to Mr. Edison when Mr. Edison started advising him concerning his will. But Dr. Jekyll refused his advice and told him how much he was interested in Hyde. He also told him that Mr. Hyde was rude when he slapped the lab's door at his face. This shows the strong relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Question 13. It can make no difference. You don't understand my position. Comment. Dr. Jekyll said that to Mr. Edison at Dr. Jekyll's house when he went to visit him and asked him about Mr. Hyde and advised him concerning his will. Dr. Jekyll told Mr. Edison that he was such an unlucky man to advise someone like him. This shows that Dr. Jekyll was insisting on what was written in his will and that he was so much interested in Hyde. It also shows that Mr. Edison's advice was all in vain and useless. Question 14. I can't pretend that I shall ever like him. Mr. Edison said that to Dr. Jekyll at Dr. Jekyll's house when he went to visit him and advised him concerning his will. Dr. Jekyll asked Mr. Edison to give Mr. Hyde all his rights if he was gone. But Mr. Edison said that he couldn't like Hyde. Dr. Jekyll told him that he didn't ask him to like Hyde. He was just asking for justice. And out of being loyal to his friend, Mr. Edison promised to give Hyde his rights if Dr. Jekyll was gone. Question 15. Mr. Hyde's maid resembled him. Discuss. She was a silver-haired old woman. She had an evil face, but her manners were excellent. A flash of cruel joy appeared on her face, and she was very happy when she realized that the visitor was a policeman and Mr. Hyde was in trouble. It seemed that she herself didn't like him. Question 16. Describe the crime of Sir Dan Vescaru. One day, a servant girl noticed a pleasant-looking old gentleman with white hair who was coming along the street while she was looking out of the window. Another small man, whom she recognized later as Mr. Hyde, was walking towards him. The old gentleman was kind and respectable. Mr. Hyde had in his hand a heavy walking stick, which he was playing with impatiently as he listened to the old man. The old man was Sir Dan Vescaru. Then all of a sudden, Mr. Hyde started shouting in anger, stamping his feet and wildly waving his stick and behaving like a madman. Sir Dan Vescaru took a step back as if he was surprised and offended. Then Mr. Hyde completely lost his temper and struck him to the ground. He stamped on him like a wild animal to the extent that the girl could hear his bones cracking. Question 17. Mention the police procedures to arrest Mr. Hyde. The police planned to wait for Mr. Hyde at the bank as he would need money. Moreover, he would put some public notices announcing that he was wanted for murder. But that was not very easy because Mr. Hyde seemed to be with no family. He had never been photographed and different people gave widely different descriptions. But they all agreed on one point, that there was something mysteriously unnatural about his appearance. Question 18. Why Mr. Edison and the police sure that Mr. Hyde was the murderer? First, the servant girl who saw the crime named the murderer and said that he was Mr. Hyde. Second, out of the girl's description of Mr. Hyde saying that he was particularly small and particularly evil, Edison was sure that the murderer was Mr. Hyde. Third, the police and Mr. Edison found half of the stick, the broken stick by which Sir Dan Vescaru was killed, in Hyde's room. And the stick was a present from Mr. Edison to Dr. Jekyll. They also found a bank account in Hyde's name because they have found a checkbook left unburned in Hyde's room.